Enigma depravatio est. Enigma crudelitas est.
Chapter 11. And the whole earth was of one language, and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel.
The legend of the Tower of Babel has been greatly misinterpreted over the millenniums. As someone who studies landscape architecture and as a Catholic, I'm going to present an alternative, more rational hypothesis on the historic Towers of Babel, being one and the same event with Plato's Atlantis and the Garden of Eden in Egypt, as I theorize in my other videos. So I also hypothesize that the original inspiration for this story came from the towers of Egypt, the pyramids, not some mud brick ziggurat. Now, you might think that Genesis is clear on the location. I assure you, after at least 3000 BC, it's changed, as YouTuber Inspiring Philosophy points out.
When most people hear of the Tower of Babel, they think of this image. Some sort of circular tower being constructed in order to reach the clouds, hundreds of meters high. But the truth is, this image came from a 16th century painter from the Netherlands, who had no knowledge of the ancient Near East. So this type of tower probably never existed. Now in Hebrew, there is no word for ziggurat, nor were there any ziggurats built in Canaan. The word they use for tower is a general word that can really refer to any large structure. So the Hebrew authors are referring to a large structure that a city was built around in the land of Sumer. The obvious and most likely structure in mind is an ancient Sumerian ziggurat. Now, correlations alone do not prove the event recorded in Genesis 11 happened. However, it also cannot be presupposed the Tower of Babel was just a mythic invention meant to attack Babylon during the Jewish exile. The text of Genesis 11 is written in a way that is describing a real event in the past. It could have been used in a way to attack the later empire of Babylon, but the authors seem to be using an historical event in the past, not inventing a legend whole cloth. And given the archaeological data, it very well could have happened during the Uruk period, which the later city of Babylon claims to have descended from. So despite the critics, we do have good evidence the Tower of Babel's story could have been a real historical event that took place in the Proto-Literate period. Last, what about the languages being confused? Well, this would be hard to prove archaeologically speaking, since it happened at a time before written records. The text of Genesis 11 says they dispersed from the region and moved out, so each group is probably untraceable and would have blended in with whatever culture they assimilated into. The only other text that might hint to this event is the Sumerian epic called Animarchar in the Lord of Arata. Some scholars believe this text is talking about a future event when everyone will worship Enlil with one tongue. But Samuel Noah Kramer believed this text was referring to a time in the past when all the people worshipped Enlil with one tongue, until his rival, the god Enki, came down and confused the languages. Enki was the patron deity of Eridu, which is referred to in the texts. It also speaks of a Nemerkar wanting to build the massive ziggurat at Eridu, and that it will be a holy mountain and an abode for the gods. So the text does make reference to Eridu, but this is all contingent on the idea that Kramer's translation is the correct one, which we have to acknowledge is disputed.
We have to keep in mind that the Bible and the Quran are libraries of fragmented stories from many authors inspired by faith and politics can get in the way, as YouTuber Black History Decodes points out.
History is a set of lies agreed upon. So, bigoted racist historians spread this nonsense about black people having no history and being inferior and uncivilized when they're being ignorant towards us and they're being uncivilized towards us, but somehow they want to flip it on us and say that we have no history and we are inferior and uncivilized. You see that? It's ridiculous. So they say whatever they want to say about the history because they're holding the cards right now. But their world order is coming to an end. Now, the Tower of Babel was in Egypt. It was in ancient Egypt. It's the Pyramid of Giza. That's the Tower of Babel. But they're going to say that it's in Iraq. And these people are misrepresenting a lot in history, and especially in the Bible. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. Now, it's like America. America has English for its language, but there's multiple people who have different languages. They have different language, but the main language is English. It's the same thing in ancient Egypt. There was many tribes in ancient Egypt. Many tribes that had their own language, but they had a main language, which was Egyptian or whatever it was, right? As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. So Shinar is actually where the pyramids are, and their temples. So they're misplacing the location and saying it's in Mesopotamia, it's in Iraq. It's not there, because names change over time. You think the names stay the same for thousands upon thousands of years? Names stay the same? No, you could change them easily. Because if I go into an area and I conquer that area, I'm not going to keep the same name. I'm going to change the name to the name I want. And this is thousands upon thousands of years of history, supposedly. That's what they say. Thousands upon thousands of years of history. So names are going to change constantly. So I'm not surprised that it's called Shinar back then, or they just mislabeled it. Now, they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." And that's exactly what the ancient Egyptians did. That's exactly what they did. We see it so many times in documentaries. And who do we talk about most? Do we talk about mostly the Mesopotamians, or do we talk about the Egyptians? We mainly talk about the Egyptians. There's even a whole study around it, Egyptology. So the ancient Egyptians were very important, but somehow the Tower of Babel is in Iraq, where there's no evidence of it, when there's evidence of it in ancient Egypt. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves, otherwise we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth. That's exactly what happened to the ancient Egyptians. Okay, and then when they scattered over the face of the earth, because I remember I said that they have different languages. There's the main language, but they have different languages because there are various tribes in ancient Egypt, and they had their own language. And then they were scattered over the face of the earth, and then they brought the information from ancient Egypt to various places, right? So they brought their own language, they brought their culture, they brought the information, And just because they brought the information in Mesopotamia doesn't mean that that history happened there. So they tell the story of Babel, but doesn't mean that it happened there, right? But they could just adopt that history, and some people could make it seem that, oh, it was there, but it wasn't there, it was somewhere else. Do you understand? So that's what happened. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. Like he comes down. Like, why does he have to come down? You see, this is man has wrote the Bible, not God. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So it's really another nation that is conspiring with other nations in order to destroy ancient Egypt, to undermine ancient Egypt. Oh, ancient Egypt is so amazing, we gotta destroy it. You know, I want what they have. You know, I want to covet what they have. So over time, this is over centuries, of course. Over centuries, it's upon centuries, eventually, you know, they're worn down and then they're scattered to different parts of the world and they create civilizations elsewhere, right? But they made their mark on the world. We see it all the time. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth and they stopped building the city. That is why it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the earth, of the whole earth. So, the Tower of Babel is the Pyramid of Giza. It's so obvious, but as I said, they conspired and they made it seem that it's in Iraq when it's not in Iraq, in order to confuse the real history. So that means the Babylonians are actually the ancient Egyptians. So the Tower of Babel is actually in Egypt.
Now, I wouldn't say that the Great Pyramid is the Tower of Babel, but all of the pyramids of Egypt are the Towers of Eden. The Reverend Archibald Henry Sayce of 1895 identifies as Shinar as a cognate from the following name of Sangara, mentioned in the context of the Asiatic conquest of Thutmose III in the 15th century BCE, written in the Amarna letters. This was in the region of Upper Mesopotamia, at the time Syria, so he argues that the place name was moved downstream following the rivers into Mesopotamia by the Hebrews and other tribes, and used the story as a literary device in a political narrative attack on Babylon. Due to place attachment, they associated the story to their assimilated lands, and they may have even forgotten the original event where it took place, or wanted to take credit to the story to fit to their new identity and their new lands. And there's another clue that points back to Egypt quite directly, as YouTuber Museum of Terror reveals.
My last video on the Great Pyramid being the Tower of Babel got some great viewer questions, so I'm going to take a moment and answer some. The first one is most obvious, with people jumping in saying, well, I always learned that Babylon was on the Euphrates in Mesopotamia. Well, that's what they tell you. The real question is, why did nobody ever tell you that Cairo, Egypt was also called Babylon?
Here's one of the maps that I showed in the original video. It's Munster's Geographica Universalis from 1540, and you can see his third table of Africa is showing Babylon and Cairo. Here's his map of the Middle East from the same book, and we can see that there is an area called Babylonia, but no Babylon as a city, no major cities or settlements there that we can see. The closest one will be Seleucia. So this is what we've got: Babylon in Egypt and an area called Babylonia in the Middle East. Historians try to tap dance around this by postulating that the Ziggurat of Ur was the Tower of Babel in Babylon, but you can see it's 214 miles away, and the Ziggurat of Ur is actually relatively small and has it's largely a modern reconstruction. It's a artistic rendition based on a foundation that was there, but they don't actually know that there was a tower on the fucking thing at all. Meanwhile, at the other Babylon in Cairo, Egypt, you've got the Great Pyramid and the Pyramid Complex right on the outskirts of town.
So which one is the real Babylon? Well, probably the one that's got the giant fucking tower sitting there.
Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Path of the Prophets. Here we are at the old Babylon fortress built by the Romans, I believe in the 300s, maybe by Dacian. And then it belonged to the Byzantines after that. And I guess the red and white striping is typical of Roman masonry. And like the hanging church used to be much higher up along the walls, but then over time it shrank, or I guess the ground rose up over. Also the Nile is very near here. There was the Persians, I mean not the Persians, but the Romans built a canal right from near this area connecting to the Red Sea for shipping and trade. Later, when the Muslims took over, I'd read that there was an attempt to come in and clean up the canal so that they could do shipping from the Mediterranean to Medina with ease, but I don't believe they were successful in that endeavor. So the first canal connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea was right at this area very early on. So this is a very interesting place with a lot of cultural, historical, and religious significance. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So yeah, Cairo was once referred to as Babylon to some people at the time. This cartographer indicates that the people in the Middle Ages may have believed that it was Egypt until the 19th century. Archaeologists started to put more focus on Iraq. There simply must have been some confusion due to how the Jews used place names to fit literary political devices for the times, just as Plato did with Persia using the Atlantis legend. This is why we can't take the Bible too literal, but realize that these simplified stories are inspired by actual events, turned into a moral or philosophical lesson. It seems clear that this name goes back to at least the Romans, who adopted the name to fit their canal fortification, which was probably built on top of an older Egyptian canal entrance into the Garden of Eden. Just as place names are used in more than one place today, so too did the ancients adopt names to different places. The question is, which came first? But the Jews and the Greeks may not be our only sources, as Graham Hancock explains.
By 1519, when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, Cholula's Great Pyramid had fallen into disrepair. But when they realized it was much more than just a hill, and asked who built it, the locals regaled them with a fascinating legend. According to myth, the Great Pyramid of Cholula was the work of a race of giants. Once upon a time, there were giants in ancient Mexico, until the rain god Tlaloc grew angry and sent a great flood to destroy them. Only 7 survived the cataclysm. Fearing that a second deluge might follow, the giant, Chelwa, known as the architect, went to Cholula and with the help of its people, built a massive artificial mountain out of bricks, a pyramid, and dedicated it to the worship of Tlaloc, the rain god. Archaeologists regard this as just a fanciful tale. But I think that by ignoring it completely, we're in danger of missing some important clues to the origins of this incredible place.
And I agree with him. These themes seem to be echoing back to a biblical legend and Atlantis. Where I diverge from Graham Hancock is that these were inspired by an original place and disseminated out over thousands of years through migration, morphing to fit to new lands. The origins of the Tower of Babel could go back as far as 6000 BC, but not during the Younger Dryas. That event may have happened in North America, but it makes no difference if there's hardly any people living there. The events in these legends seem to be hinting to a surgical natural disaster triggered by supernatural creatures. Unlike Graham Hancock, I do agree with Dr. Michael S. Heiser and theologians that the mention of giants seems to be a consistent theme that we cannot ignore, as I explained in my other videos. And I think it's just a matter of time when some evidence of these mutant humans may be declassified. So we can't get caught up in the linguistics and chronology that we fail to look at the obvious with a deeper logic. Now, through a God's eyes lens, all these major pyramids of the world, like at Cholula and Cahokia, act as towers of Babel. But there was an original place that inspired these lesser pyramid towers. The pagan summoning platforms, as the Quran emphasized, was about black magic, summoning the jinn, aka UAPs, not ETs. As someone in the field of landscape architecture, I would also say we need to follow the architecture for clues as well, pointed out by YouTuber Ancient Architects.
The city of Ur was one of the most important Sumerian city-states in ancient Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BC, and one of the best preserved and most spectacular remains of this ancient city is the Great Ziggurat of Ur. The Great Ziggurat, which is today located in the Dekar province in southern Iraq, is a massive step pyramid construction measuring 64 metres in length, 46 metres in width, and 30 metres in height. The height, however, is just speculation, as only the bottom of the structure survives today, and even this has been heavily renovated. The most significant excavations of the Great Ziggurat were conducted over a 12-year period beginning in 1922 by archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley. The ziggurat first revealed by these excavations was not the same structure we see today, as much of the monument now has elements of modern reconstruction based on how scholars believe it once looked. It consists of successively smaller platforms that had a core of mud brick, which was covered in burnt brick, and was designed in such a way to protect the core from the elements. The square-shaped holes that we see on the sides are not windows as some might think, but a way for excess moisture to escape the structure. The construction of the ziggurat began under King Ur-Nammu of the 3rd dynasty of Ur around the 21st century BC and was completed by his son King Shulgi. The structure was located in the temple complex of the city-state, which was the administrative heart of ancient Ur. Apparently, the people of ancient Mesopotamia believed that their gods had needs like humans, and a bedchamber was provided for Nana in the shrine. It was apparently occupied by a maiden who was chosen to be the god's companion. I think it makes more sense that a Sumerian high priest and his maiden would have occupied the shrine at the top, as opposed to it being a physical abode for the mythical moon god. On the side stairway of the ziggurat's northwestern part was a kitchen, which again we are told was likely used to prepare food for the god, but I would say for the high priest. The god's mortal servants were provided for as well, and the outer enclosure of the ziggurat contained a temple storehouse, the houses of the priests, and a royal ceremonial palace. Ziggurats were not just a religious building dedicated to a god, they were central, important locations in each Sumerian city, and were the centres of innovation. They were part of larger temple complexes where young men would study in scribal schools, and these complexes were probably more akin to primitive universities than religious temples. Over time, the great city disappeared from human memory and would be forgotten until the 19th century AD. This is when European exploration in the Mesopotamian region rediscovered it. Excavations were carried out and the remains of the Great Ziggurat were rediscovered. Sir Leonard Woolley was the archaeologist who excavated the site in the 1920s. He dug deep underneath the structure and found that what was built by King Ur-Nammu wasn't the first structure on the site. It was built on top of an older structure from the early dynastic period between 2900 and 2350 BC, and even this was found to rest on even more archaic remains. Whilst making this video, I looked at representations of a number of ziggurats, and I was surprised by the similarities between these Mesopotamian structures and the core of the Pyramid of Meidum in Egypt, which I believe was the original structure. When researching pre-dynastic Egypt, there are also a number of similarities between Egyptian and Mesopotamian culture, and I think the two empires were more closely aligned than we are currently told. The origins of Sumerian culture reach back far into prehistory, and as we have seen, they clearly had an established understanding of astronomy and mathematics. The origins of the Sumerians will be a topic for a future video, but researchers have suggested that Sumer may have been initiated by an ancient seafaring civilization that had its origins elsewhere, and some speculate that they could have been the survivors of the Great Flood, or at the very least had memories of this cataclysmic event in their heritage and traditions. Did the survivors of a lost ancient civilization settle in various places on the earth, one being Egypt and another Mesopotamia? Did these people lead these two separate civilizations to power? There is much to consider, but the similarities between these two civilizations cannot go unnoticed.
As you can see, this is really not a tower but a raised platform for the local ruler. It's possible the original ruler may have been one of these Nephilim kings of Atlantis, arriving after the flood, something at the level of the floods of Pakistan, but maybe even worse. So they traveled to the Persian Gulf while others traveled along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean region, settling near Syria, and then following the rivers down to Sumer. This is where I disagree with David Rohl, where he has found evidence of boats going back to some 3000 BC indicating trade between Sumer and Egypt. But he's sticking with the precedent set by 20th century archaeologists that Egyptian civilization came from Sumer, but I think it's vice versa. Artists have greatly misrepresented the actual size of ziggurats. Before the theory of ziggurats, artists were taking inspiration from the Muslim minaret towers like the Great Mosque of Samarra, until people like Dr. David Rohl popularized the theory of the Tower of Babel being a ziggurat, which motivated many artists to start rendering ziggurats bigger than they really were. But most archaeologists don't believe ziggurats were 200 feet tall, but most were 130 feet, and artists started to depict ziggurats being 300 feet. There is no evidence that they ever reached that height, and even if they did, they're still less tall than the pyramids of Egypt and less massive. Ziggurats were meant to raise the height of the king and queen's chambers. On the third level, there may have been some rooms where the king resided, with the temple shrine being on top. The height was designed to be just tall enough to be above the palm trees and 3-story mud brick houses and the height of the city walls. Anything above 200 feet was excessive. They never intended ziggurats to be a pyramid tower, instead more of a stepped temple platform or stepped pyramid, where there were living quarters and a temple, similar to Aztec temples, but actually less massive than those. This isn't to say that the ziggurats weren't like the Towers of Babel. In fact, it may have been inspired by the original Towers of Babel of Egypt, and the architectural function we see at the ziggurats can give us a clue to what the real function of the pyramids were, for which YouTuber History for Granted may give us a clue.
In this video, we're going to explore the anomalies surrounding a centerpiece of the pyramid, the sarcophagus built for Khafre. A common term for a squared, outermost stone barrier that could protect a body is the word coffer. It's also much easier to pronounce, and so that's the word I will use. Let me also take a moment to address a few points for the viewers who are skeptical that the pyramids were made to be tombs. I must state that I believe the evidence that pyramids from the 4th dynasty onward were designed to hold the body of a pharaoh is quite strong. The pattern of pyramid corridors leading to coffers becomes increasingly standardized as you move forward in time. And if that's not enough, by the end of the 5th dynasty, you get pyramid texts that express it literally. However, I am sympathetic to the notion that Old Kingdom pyramids were built with more complexity and precision than necessary for a pile of rocks protecting a mummy. The word tomb is inadequate to describe these pyramids. Some analogies might be that you don't call a Capitol building a tomb just because a leader is laid to rest there, nor would you call a cathedral a tomb just because deceased are buried underneath it in catacombs. In that spirit, I believe we can find common ground in that the story of a pyramid isn't limited to the burial of a pharaoh.
After watching YouTuber History for Granite's videos, I started to notice something about the chambers of these pyramid towers, in that they may not just be burials. Although that is one of the main functions, there may be another. Learning about the ziggurats and seeing the interior design of the niche in the so-called Queen's Chamber, I start to wonder if these chambers acted as secondary throne rooms. Now talk about a tower of pride. This would have been very intimidating for any emissary ordered to meet the pharaohs of Atlantis inside these pyramids if they existed during the time of Atlantis. The tunnels of these chambers would have been big enough for an 8-foot human king if he was transported on these sleds connected by pulleys and cranked by normal-sized guardsmen. These mutant humans would lie on their backs like one does in a sarcophagus, or sit on a sled being mechanically pulled until they reach the next sled at a junction. Emissaries may have also been transported this way depending on if they were worthy. If not, they would have had to crawl their way to the king, following the distant light torches to the next tunnel. Talk about an intimidation tactic. Now when it comes to the burials, I do agree they were used as tombs, but I would not be surprised if the sarcophagus in the chamber was actually used as like a council table in some cases. And the niche in the so-called Queen's Chamber was the place where the pharaoh sits in his gilded chair. This was a throne room. The niche is off-centered to the right to give room for the open tunnel where the sled may have been cranked in. Now the pyramids were tombs, but they're not a tomb for any one pharaoh. Pharaohs would have been rotated in and out depending on who's ruling at the time. So the current son of the last king would be ruling and then would sit in the throne of the pyramids, and his father's body would lie in that chamber until he dies, and his body then replaces his father's body until the next king, and the cycle continues. So this was a temporary pyramid tomb for the king and his dynastic family at the time until the next dynasty comes into power to replace them, and then those bodies would be taken out, which makes the pyramids a true monument of a nation, not any one pharaoh. But the issue of this hypothesis is, wouldn't the Nephilim kings and queen of Atlantis have bigger coffers? This makes me think that the current coffers are from the later dynasties, when the normal humans inherited the remnants of Atlantis. The dimensions of these would actually fit through the corridors if the lids were taken off and a slab was lifted to angle the coffer up the descending corridor through mechanical pulleys, and possibly on metal bronze rail tracks with a sled. If the Nephilim did occupy these throne tombs, they may not have used stone coffers if the pyramids acted as temporary throne room tombs. Instead, they may have hoisted 8 to 9 foot wooden coffins down the corridor into the chamber where they would have been propped up facing along the wall, with the throne chair being at the back or in a niche, or on a raised stone slabs like we see in the Khafre pyramid. These giant coffins may have had to be transported into 2 pieces with the lid and the main coffin, and then would be ceremonially dressed in the throne room chamber. For these coffins do look like they were designed to be propped up along the wall. Another scenario is that there were larger coffers placed during the construction of the pyramids, but then was completely broken into pieces to be hauled out of the pyramid to make way for the new human rulers. So the human pharaohs would have had to design their coffers to fit the passageways, making them seem smaller for the chambers. Now I'm going to revise my timeline for the dating of the Towers of Eden as another scenario we should consider. These clues may help us narrow down when the Towers of Babel were started. They may actually have existed during the time of Atlantis, if Atlantis is not as old as we make it out to be. So this is my revised timeline clues we need to consider. Please refer to my Atlantis series on the other timeline scenario. I know many of you want to appeal to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. I too wanted it to be true. But ironically, the Younger Dryas may not have destroyed civilization, but kick-started civilization by changing the environmental conditions. If Egypt truly is the inspiration for Eden, the Tower of Babel, and Atlantis, we have to connect it with all the other contexts we do have to narrow down the time of this surgical natural disaster that dispersed people creating new languages, or what the Tower of Babel legend describes as the confusion of languages. The first clue we need to consider is when the sea levels stopped rising, and that is indicated with the rapid filling of the Black Sea over a few hundred years, forcing people on the coastlines to find new agricultural plains. This is about the time when horses start to move into the Middle East and domestication began. So Atlantis must have been after the gradual sea level rising after the end of the Ice Age. And that was around 5600 BC. The next clue we need to consider is the orthodox dating of creation, the genesis of civilization. And most theologians put that around 5508 BC. Another clue we need to consider is Colonel Alexander Bragin and de Grazia's hypothesis of Halley's Comet fragment impact hypothesis. So there still might be an impact connection with Atlantis. And this is dated to around 4015 BC. The next clue we need to consider is the Piora Oscillation around 3900 BC, at the end of the late African human period. This is an unusual event because they're not sure if this is connected with Halley's Comet or some kind of impact may have happened to cause this change in the environment. This is a lot sharper than even the Younger Dryas, but it's very minuscule detection, which means this is a more surgical event. Which is interesting because some scientists say that the Black Sea rose 300 feet above its normal flood stage and then rapidly decrease. So something caused a major oscillation in the jet stream, causing a lot more monsoons to get up into the Middle East and flooding the regions along rivers and lakes and seas. So this could have a connection with the Great Flood, give or take a margin of error of 1,000 years or so. Another clue we need to consider is Peter James and Francis Hitchenson's The World Atlantis Mysterious Orthodox Dating of the Dynastic Egyptian Origins. They're basically saying that the origins of civilization, or the origins of Egypt before the pyramids, is around 3600 BC. Now, I do disagree with this. I do think that the civilization of Egypt does go farther back in time, but this shows that this date is overlapping with the other clues, give or take 1,000-year margin of error or so. The next clue we should consider is by Roderick Breitda's hypothesis on Atlantis. He argues that Plato was right, that 9,000 years is about right, but we fail to understand the translation of that could be based off the Egyptian timeline of the seasons. So taking that and dividing it by the 3 main seasons, then we get about 3590 BC included into Solon's trip to Egypt. So this would fit closer to the mainstream archaeological record, but also keep in mind of another margin of error of a couple thousand years that could overlap with these other clues. And a final clue we should consider is the Burckle crater impact hypothesis. Now, the dating on this is debated. Currently, it's around 3000 BC. Randall Carlson describes that there's not enough research totally on this crater and more needs to be done. But some major event may have happened in the Indian Ocean off of the coasts of Madagascar in Africa, and this could have affected the oscillation of the jet stream flows, causing unusual patterns in the monsoon events. The question is there a major margin of error on the current dating of this? Because they're dating some of the organic material in Madagascar, which may have margins of error of a couple thousand years. So when we put all this together, we can kind of put like a medium date of around 4000 BC, or possibly connected with Halley's Comet and the oscillation effect. And this connects basically exactly near what the Bible described. Okay, not necessarily the origins of the planet Earth, okay, no Catholic really believes that, but the origins of civilization. And this fits closely to the archaeological record and the missing link of the technological gap between Egypt and Göbekli Tepe. So Göbekli Tepe fills in that gap, that technological progression. So we still have this idea of civilization progressing in time. It's not that civilization was restarted, okay? There's simply just kind of a bump in the road, just like the stock market. Civilizations may have setbacks. The arrow of time may go back slightly, the arrow may be smaller and going back, but eventually the overall trend is still progressing in societal growth based on population growth. And Egypt, or the Towers of Babel and Atlantis, are the origins of that civilization, of our civilization, the whole planet basically. From technologies of steel to domestication of animals and agriculture, all that can be traced back to the Middle East, and possibly from an original civilization that did have a major setback for a couple thousand years and then was restarted again, and that was Egypt. And to this day, we've inherited that knowledge and technology that's been passed down since Atlantis. Atlantis never truly died, it just morphed and changed and had some setbacks. It morphed into Egypt. Then from there it morphed into the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then America. Older doesn't necessarily mean better. America is very powerful, but it's not that old of a civilization. But at the time, Egypt, if Atlantis was real, and it does date to around 5000 BC or 4000 BC, that is still relatively old for a civilization that is relatively advanced compared to anything else on the planet at the time. So the next time you are seeking the seduction of the towers of Atlantis as you are passing through the pillars of Hercules, be vigilant, for that ancient serpent may be right next to you. If Atlantis was a snake, we all have been bitten by it. This has been Enigma Seeker. Keep seeking those enigmas.